He walked through the iron gates like any other man accused of petty crime, his shoulders slouched, his eyes lowered, his clothes torn and dusty. The guards barely looked up. The warden signed off the transfer papers without reading the name twice. Even the inmates in the yard didn't pause long enough to care. After all, prisoners arrived every week, and this one looked no different. Black skin dulled from sun and sweat, face unshaven, jaw bruised, as if he'd already been introduced to a few fists. But what no one knew, what no one could imagine, was that this man, walking past armed guards and barbed wire in silence, was not a criminal at all. He was the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, and he had just willingly entered one of the most feared prisons in the country. No protection, no aids, no secret service. Just a fake ID, a name pulled from thin air, and a mission that would shake the nation's conscience. Reports had crossed his desk for months, official inspections, carefully written statements from the warden, letters from ministry officials, all painting the same picture. Conditions improving, discipline effective, no mistreatment. But Traoré had lived long enough to know that corruption never confesses itself. He had grown up on the same streets as the men now locked behind these walls. He knew what power did when left unchecked, especially in dark corners of society where the cameras never reached. And then came the anonymous letters, not just one, several, some written in shaky, desperate handwriting, others from insiders, anonymous guards afraid for their lives. They all said the same thing: racism, torture, extortion, starvation, death, hidden rooms, fake reports, inmates going missing without a trace. No one cared because no one believed them. Traoré did. And there was only one way to know the truth. He would see it with his own eyes, feel it with his own skin. The guard at the intake desk looked up, expression blank. Name? Moussa Diop, Traoré said. It wasn't a lie, it was a borrowed truth. The name of a man who had died unjustly in a prison just like this one. The irony wasn't lost on him. Crime? Attempted robbery. No weapon. Cell block C7. The guard muttered, scribbling lazily on a clipboard. Enjoy hell. They took his fingerprints. They gave him a uniform, threadbare and crusted with stains. No shoes, no soap. Just a bunk number and a warning. Don't speak unless spoken to. Traoré nodded, already understanding that in this world, silence was the only shield. Inside Block C7, time moved differently. There was no sense of morning or evening, just hunger and noise. As he stepped into his new cell, eyes followed him like hunting dogs. Suspicion, curiosity, and above all, caution. Every newcomer could be a snitch, a thief, a threat. He sat on the edge of the lower bunk and kept his gaze steady. The walls were cracked and yellowed, the mattress thin as a rag. A foul stench lingered in the air, rot, sweat, mold. His cellmates didn't speak right away. They studied him, watched him breathe, watched how he moved, and then finally, one voice broke the silence. Hey, new guy, what did you do? Traoré looked up and met the speaker's eyes. He was massive, his arms covered in faded tattoos, a scar splitting his eyebrow. The others deferred to him instinctively. A leader, a lion among broken men. Store robbery, Traoré said calmly, his tone unbothered. Did you get away with anything? The man asked, leaning forward. Didn't even have a gun. Wasn't really trying hard, Traoré replied with a faint smile. The man barked out a laugh. Bad luck, huh? Or maybe just stupid. He extended a hand. Name's Bari. This is my jungle. You cross me, you don't wake up. But if you're smart, we might just get along. Traoré shook his hand. I'm not looking for trouble. Bari's grin disappeared. Nobody is, but here trouble finds you, especially if you're dark, broke, and alone. There's a system. The lighter ones, the ones with family on the outside, they get medicine, food, protection. The rest of us? He gestured to the rest of the cell, where gaunt faces stared out from shadows. We rot. There was no misunderstanding. Racism wasn't whispered here, it was law. You were judged not just by your file, but by your face. Your skin was a sentence on top of a sentence. The deeper the hue, the less you mattered. The guards didn't bother hiding it. Inmates with fairer skin or foreign names got blankets, extra rations, sometimes even favors. The rest were left to fight for scraps. You're not the only one who doesn't belong here, Bari added. But you'd better learn quick. Fairness doesn't live in Koro. Hate does. That night, Traoré laid awake on the stone-cold mattress, listening to the sobs of a boy no older than 20. Somewhere across the block, someone was coughing violently, followed by the thud of a boot and a cruel laugh. A scream echoed once, then vanished. And as he stared at the cracked ceiling, the truth sank in. He hadn't walked into a prison. He had stepped into the belly of a racist machine designed to crush the voiceless, one man at a time. The first night passed like a fever dream. Sleep didn't come, not truly. It hovered somewhere just beyond reach, interrupted by coughs, footsteps, and the occasional moan that drifted through the block like a ghost. But as the grey morning light crept through the barred windows, something else caught Traoré's attention. Something that didn't belong to the usual sounds of prison. A low, broken whimper. Not loud, not even constant. Just a faint, trembling sound like someone trying to hold back pain that had become too familiar. It came from the far corner of the cell block. At first he thought it was someone crying in their sleep, but as the light sharpened and the fog of night cleared, he saw him. A boy, or at least what was left of one. His body was curled up on a stained mattress, skin stretched thin over bone, his cheeks sunken, his lips cracked. Every breath looked like a battle. Sweat soaked his shirt and matted his hair. His eyes, half open and glazed, stared into a space no one else could see. The trembling never stopped, not even when he lay still. Traoré leaned closer to the man next to him. "What's wrong with him?" he whispered. "Gaspar," the man replied, his voice low and tired. "He got beat 2 weeks ago, ribs shattered, got an infection. Now it's all over his body." "Hasn't anyone called a doctor?" The man chuckled bitterly. "Doctor? You think they'd waste medicine on someone like him? They call him the shadow behind his back. Too black, too quiet, no family, no bribe money. He's invisible to them." Invisible. The word hit Traoré like a punch. He looked again at Gaspar, whose eyelids fluttered as if hearing his name spoken gave him a reason to hold on. How many Gaspars were here? How many men discarded not just because they had committed a crime, but because of who they were, how they looked, how little they were worth in a system where worth was measured in skin tone and connections. They told him if he couldn't pay for treatment, he should pray. He did, and look what good it did him. Later, when the guards came, they didn't check on Gaspar. They didn't ask if he was breathing. They just stepped over him like he was part of the floor. One even muttered, "Still not dead?" as he passed. That morning Gaspar didn't move at all, and when they finally noticed he wasn't groaning anymore, 2 guards came in with a stretcher and dragged him out like a sack of garbage. His head lolled to the side, his legs bouncing limply against the iron bed frames. One guard laughed. "Another one bites the dust." Traoré clenched his fists. The rage burned hot in his chest, but he kept his face still. He was a prisoner. He had to act like one. Reacting meant suspicion. Suspicion meant isolation, or worse, a visit to the room no one returned from. That day they moved him to the kitchen. It smelled even worse than the cell block. The stench of rotting vegetables, grease and mildew hung in the air like a fog. Inmates worked in silence, chopping, peeling, stirring, robots on the verge of breaking. A massive pot simmered in the center of the room, releasing a sickly steam that clung to their skin. A guard stood nearby with a baton, slapping it against his palm rhythmically, watching them all. An old man handed Traoré a knife. "Start with those," he muttered, pointing to a pile of potatoes with black spots and oozing mush. Some were already growing mold, others were soft as rotten fruit. Flies hovered above them like vultures. "These are inedible," Traoré said, his voice quiet but firm. The old man snorted. "These ain't for the guards, they're for us." He tilted his chin toward the back of the room. Another cauldron sat on a separate stove, filled with fresh meat, clean rice, chopped vegetables. Around it, a separate team of inmates, better fed, lighter skinned, worked under less scrutiny. One of them even joked with the guard. "What are they cooking?" "The guard's lunch," the old man replied. "See, there's 2 kitchens here, one for them, one for us. They eat chicken, we eat bone broth, if we're lucky. They eat bread, we get crusts soaked in mold. It's always been that way." "But we're all in the same prison," Traoré said. The old man looked at him with tired eyes. "Not really. They've got their favorites. You're black and unknown? You're garbage. You're lighter or got a cousin in the police? You get treated like royalty. You're from the wrong village, the wrong tribe, the wrong background, that's it. You're marked." The separation was clear now. This wasn't just about prisoners and guards. It was about caste, color, privilege. It was about racism embedded so deep in the walls that it stained everything, from the food they ate to the pain they endured. The old man sighed and kept peeling. "You want to live long in here? Don't talk, don't ask, don't care, just survive." But Traoré couldn't pretend. He couldn't just survive, because he wasn't really one of them, and yet he was all of them. Every story he was hearing, every injustice he was witnessing, was a reflection of the truth that had always existed beneath the surface of the nation. He had to go deeper. He had to see more. The rot wasn't just in the food. It was in the system, and it had a face, a name, a seat of power. And very soon, that power was going to be challenged. It was after lights out, in the suffocating stillness of Block C7, that Bari whispered to him. The cell was dark, except for a single bulb flickering at the far end of the hallway. Most of the men were either asleep or pretending to be, lying still like corpses to avoid attracting attention. But Traoré had learned by now, night didn't bring rest in this place. It brought whispers, secrets, and fear that had learned to speak in low voices. Bari shifted closer on his bunk, just enough that no one else would hear. "There's a door at the end of the corridor," he said, his voice gravelly and cautious. "Looks like any other, metal, rusted, no sign. But you go through that door and you come back different, if you come back at all." Traoré turned his head slightly, his breathing slow. "What's in there?" Bari didn't answer right away. He just stared forward, his jaw tense, as if remembering something that still haunted him. "They call it the room," he said finally. "That's all. No one calls it by name. Because even a name gives it power. You get taken in for asking too many questions, for complaining, for being too loud, sometimes for nothing at all, just because you're the wrong kind of person. Too poor, too dark, too unwanted." He paused again, and this time Traoré didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, heavy and thick with memory. Eventually Bari continued, more quietly now. "The guards say it's just for discipline, but we know better. We hear the screams, the banging. We see the bodies come back, if they come back. Gaspar was one of them. He wasn't beaten in the yard. He was taken to the room. When he came back, he couldn't speak for 3 days. Then he started crying every night. Then he stopped crying. And then nothing, just silence and fever." Traoré's blood ran cold. Everything he had read in those anonymous letters, he was hearing now with his own ears. And it was worse, much worse. The racism wasn't just in the food or the insults or the favoritism. It was institutionalized into pain. It was calculated. The darker the skin, the more disposable the life. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would they do this?" Bari's laugh was sharp and hollow. "Money. Always money. You see, every inmate is worth a budget. On paper, the government sends funds for our food, our medicine, our rehabilitation, but that money doesn't reach us. It disappears somewhere between the ministry and the warden's pocket. They keep us starving, sick, scared, because it's cheaper that way. And if you die, they just forge some paper, say you got released, or escaped, or never existed. The darker your skin, the faster you vanish. Because no one asks questions, no one writes letters, no one cares. Traoré didn't sleep that night. The screams came again, long and ragged. Somewhere a man was begging. Then silence. He didn't need to ask where the voice had gone. He already knew. The next day began like the others, with a bell, with barking orders, with stale bread and boiled water passed off as breakfast. But there was a shift in the air. Traoré felt it the moment two guards appeared at his cell door. They didn't speak, just pointed. One gestured with his baton, the other with a cruel smirk. "You, let's go. The warden wants to meet you." There was no point in resisting. Traoré stood, keeping his expression neutral. Around him the other inmates froze. Even Bari looked away. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel to judgment. Each step was deliberate, echoing off the concrete. And then he saw it, the door, just as Bari had described. Plain, dented, paint peeling. It looked like nothing, but it hummed with dread. They shoved him inside. The room was colder than the hall, and the stink hit him immediately. Sweat, blood, metal, something acrid and burnt. The walls were stained, not fresh, old stains, dried patterns that told stories of beatings and suffering in colors the guards had never bothered to clean. In one corner, electric cables coiled like snakes, batons, pipes, a rusted chair bolted to the floor with leather straps stained dark. And then the door closed behind him. Warden Traoré entered a few moments later, dressed neatly, like a man about to host a banquet rather than an interrogation. His eyes were hard and empty. In his hands he held a file, Traoré's fake dossier. He flipped through it lazily. "Moussa Diop," he said, reading. "Petty thief, repeat offender, no known relatives, no lawyer." He closed the file and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The perfect candidate. Traoré said nothing. "You've been talking," Traoré continued, "to Bari, to the others, asking questions. That's not what prisoners do here. Prisoners keep their heads down. But you think you're special?" "I just wanted to understand," Traoré said evenly. "Oh, I'll make sure you understand," Traoré said, nodding to one of the guards. "Here's how it works. We keep this place running with bribes. You got family? They pay. You get medicine. You get food. You get out early. You don't? You rot, or you scream, or you disappear. It's a beautiful system, efficient, clean, and no one on the outside cares. They think we're the bad guys for keeping the streets safe, but the real secret is we profit more when we don't rehabilitate. Dead men don't complain." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "So let me ask you again. Do you have family? Anyone to pay for you?" Traoré met his gaze. "Number, but I have something else." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What's that?" Without flinching, Traoré reached slowly into the lining of his pants and pulled out a tiny device, barely the size of a coin, a single button. He pressed it. A red light blinked once. Traoré's smile faltered. "What is that?" he asked. Traoré didn't move. "It's the beginning of your end." And somewhere outside, the silence was breaking. Traoré took a step back, eyes darting to the blinking light in Traoré's hand. His voice, once arrogant and assured, now cracked with the sharp edge of confusion. What did you do?" He tried to wave toward the guards, but hesitation had crept into his command. Something about Traoré's calm, his silence, his stillness, struck a note of fear that even Traoré couldn't name. The guards moved toward Traoré with mechanical aggression, but before they could lay a hand on him, the iron door burst open. It didn't creak. It exploded. Black-clad figures poured into the room, masked and armed with precision. Special forces, elite units, not just guards from the capital, but men who moved with the unshakable confidence of those who protected something greater than power, those who protected truth. The first two neutralized the guards without a word. The third aimed directly at Traoré, who raised his hands instinctively, stumbling back as if gravity itself was turning against him. Wait! What is this? Who are you people?" His voice was rising now, shrill and desperate. But Traoré didn't answer. Not yet. He rose from the chair slowly, deliberately. The illusion was gone, the slouched posture, the downcast eyes, the voice of a humble prisoner, shed like old skin. What stood in that room now wasn't Moussa Diop. It was Ibrahim Traoré, head held high, spine straight, eyes sharp. The president of Burkina Faso, in the flesh, standing not at a podium or a palace, but in the middle of a blood-stained torture room, facing a man who had built an empire of racism, cruelty, and silence. Kabore's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I'm the one you've been torturing through others," Traoré said, his voice steady, quiet, and unshakable. "I'm the man whose name you've forged on false reports. I'm the man you thought would never come to see what happens when no one is watching." He stepped forward. "I am Ibrahim Traoré, and you, Kabore, are under arrest." The guards didn't need a second command. Kabore tried to resist, but his knees betrayed him. His voice turned to pleading. I didn't know. I was just doing my job. The orders came from the ministry, from above." Traoré didn't blink. "I am the ministry. I am above, and I gave no such orders." Kabore's arms were pulled behind his back. The crack of handcuffs echoed like justice returning to a place it had long abandoned. Outside, more soldiers moved through the corridors. Prisoners watched in silence as guards were disarmed, interrogated, escorted out. For the first time, the fear shifted. It no longer sat on the backs of the inmates. It now clung to the shoulders of the oppressors. The next morning, the prison yard was filled like never before. Every prisoner, every guard, every staff member stood in rows, their faces drawn by disbelief, exhaustion, hope. Traoré stood before them, not in a suit, not in robes, but in the same plain clothes he had worn as an inmate. No guards flanked him, no walls separated him. He stood among them as one of them. "This prison," he began, his voice carrying without force, "was meant to be a place of correction, a place of rehabilitation, but it became a graveyard for men who were simply forgotten. It became a factory of pain, and at the root of it all, racism, poverty, corruption, the belief that some lives matter less than others because of skin, status, or silence." He turned toward the staff, the guards, the officers. "You thought the world wouldn't see, that these walls could bury your crimes, but the world is watching now, and justice has eyes." There was a pause, long and heavy, and then he continued, "Some of you followed orders. Some of you watched and said nothing, and some of you took pleasure in cruelty. You will all face a trial, a fair trial, not the kind you gave others, but one rooted in truth, because real justice does not imitate revenge, it replaces it." He looked back at the inmates. "And you, all of you, were not forgotten. You are not worthless. You are not invisible. I came here to see, to feel, to know. And now I promise you this. The system that brought you here in chains will be dismantled piece by piece. And in its place, we will build something better. Not just for the innocent, but for everyone who deserves a second chance." He paused again and looked out across the yard, across the cracked concrete, the rusted bars, the bruises that hadn't yet healed. "This prison will be closed, permanently, its foundations broken. In its place, a center will rise, not for punishment, but for rehabilitation, and the first bricks will be laid with the names of those who suffered here, starting with Gaspard." Heads turned, some nodded, some wept, and some, for the first time in years, dared to smile. Bari stepped forward from the crowd, eyes locked on Traoré. "You really were one of us," he said, his voice thick, "all this time." "I always was," Traoré replied. "I just had to return to remember." And with that, the walls of Koro prison began to crumble, not from dynamite or fire, but from the weight of truth, spoken aloud and made real. In the weeks that followed, Koro prison ceased to exist, not just in structure, but in spirit. The transformation wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, methodical, and rooted in something far more powerful than politics, the lived testimony of every man who had survived behind those walls. Bulldozers came and tore down the concrete facades that had once held screams inside. Barbed wire was dismantled strand by strand. Every rusted gate was removed, every blood-stained wall destroyed. The place that had been a monument to cruelty was now a memory. In its place rose something that had never existed in that land before, a center built not on punishment, but on healing. The new facility was unlike anything the country had seen. There were classrooms where the torture rooms once stood. A library filled the space that had been used for isolation cells. Where the guards had once hoarded fresh food for themselves, a soup kitchen now served meals prepared with dignity, clean, balanced, nutritious, shared equally by staff and inmates alike. And where the infamous room had once broken men into silence, there stood a counseling center, staffed by trauma specialists and human rights volunteers, committed to listening to every voice that had once been silenced. The same prisoners who had been stripped of their humanity were now wearing clean clothes, holding books, planting trees, and learning skills that would allow them to re-enter society as more than shadows. The same inmates who once feared the sound of approaching boots now held meetings to draft ideas for further reforms. Gaspar, once on the edge of death, now walked with renewed strength, working in the infirmary as an assistant, helping others who arrived broken, just as he had been helped. Bari, once the feared lion of cell block C7, now served as a coordinator for health and hygiene initiatives. He wore a badge, not of authority but of service, and his voice, once coarse with rage, now carried hope. When the day came for Ibrahim Traoré to return, there was no grand ceremony, no staged welcome. He arrived in simple clothes, walking through the open gates without an entourage, without applause. And yet, the silence that greeted him was not emptiness, it was reverence. Former inmates stood in the courtyard, eyes wide with quiet awe. Some didn't even believe it was really him until he smiled. Bari stepped forward, eyes moist, words caught in his throat. "You kept your word," he said. "You really did." Traoré nodded. "I only did what should have been done long before me. I'm not here to be thanked. I'm here to make sure it never happens again." He walked through the corridors that had once echoed with the cries of the forgotten. Now they were filled with the sound of laughter, of discussions, of footsteps without fear. In the new library he paused before a shelf labeled Testimonies. It held journals written by former prisoners about their time in the old Coro. Each story was raw, personal, painful, and yet each was a declaration of survival. Standing in the courtyard, Traoré addressed them one final time, not with fanfare, not with slogans, but with truth. A prison system, he said, is more than its walls. It is a mirror of a nation. When our prisons reflect cruelty, corruption, and racism, it means those evils live among us. But when they reflect dignity, fairness, and healing, it means we have chosen a different future. And that choice begins today, here. He turned to Gaspar, who had watched quietly from the side. "You said I saved your life," Traoré said. "But the truth is, you saved mine. You reminded me that no leader can rule a nation unless he's willing to stand with its most wounded, and no nation is truly free until its weakest are protected." The courtyard was still, but the stillness was full, heavy with a quiet pride that came not from victory, but from redemption. As Traoré moved through the crowd, shaking hands, embracing old cellmates, he wasn't treated like a president or a hero, he was treated like a brother. A man who had come down into the darkest part of the country's soul and returned not just to tell the tale, but to rebuild it. The story of Coro didn't end with the demolition of its walls. It lived on, in every reformed policy, in every re-educated guard, in every prisoner who walked free not just in body, but in spirit. Traoré and his accomplices were fairly tried, their crimes laid bare before the courts, not in the shadows. Their punishment was just, not because of vengeance, but because justice had finally returned to a place where it had long been exiled. Across Burkina Faso, the name Ibrahim Traoré took on new meaning, not just as a leader, but as a witness. A man who had worn the rags, slept on the cold stone, felt the hunger, and endured the hate not because he had to, but because he chose to. His journey became a story retold in classrooms, on radio waves, around family fires. A story of what happens when power listens, when leadership feels, when truth walks barefoot through the mud and comes out standing. And so Koro, the prison that once broke spirits, became the place where a nation found its soul.